Greetings, Lore Masters. Tonight our chronicle covers the very beginning of Skyrim's greatest conflict, the Dragon War. We see the crumbling tombs and the skeletal remains of dragons, but the true story begins long before the first Nord ever lifted an axe. It begins when time itself decided to create a monster. We picture dragons breathing fire and hoarding gold, but the first ones hoarded something far more potent: absolute power. Let's be honest, you probably wouldn't survive 5 minutes in the Merethic era without being a bit chilly, and also immediately devoured or enslaved by a dragon priest. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Go ahead and post your location and local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where everyone is tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Before there was war, before there was even a Skyrim to fight over, there was chaos. The world of Mundus was new, a messy, unstable creation spun from the compromise and sacrifice of the Aedra. It was a realm where the very concept of before and after was a suggestion, not a law. Into this cosmic soup stepped Akatosh, the great dragon, the chief deity of the divines. His entire purpose was to impose order, to draw a line through the chaos and create the arrow of time. He was time, and from his very being he spun off children. These were not children in the mortal sense. They were the Dove, the dragons. And this is the first crucial thing we must understand. The dragons were not merely powerful lizards. They were, each of them, sentient fragments of the time god himself. This is why their language, the Thu'um, is power. When a dragon speaks, it is not just vibrating its vocal cords, it is imposing its timeless will upon a temporary world. This fundamental nature, this obscure lore tidbit from the deepest corners of Tamrielic metaphysics, is the key to their arrogance. A mortal is born, lives a frantic, scrambling life, and then dies. To a dragon, a mortal life is less than the blink of an eye. They don't experience time linearly as we do. They remember the beginning, they see the end, and the present is just a single point in an eternal line. Being a fragment of time is a great excuse, by the way, for never being punctual. At the very head of this magnificent, terrifying brood was Alduin. He was the anointed, the firstborn of Akatosh, the World Eater. His power was absolute, second only to his father. And here, we must touch upon one of the oldest debates in the Elder Scrolls community. Is Alduin actually Akatosh? Is he just the Nordic, gloomier aspect of the time god, the way Akatosh is the imperial version and Auriel is the elven? Or is he truly just the first creation? The texts are murky, written by mortals trying to comprehend the divine, but the most common understanding, the one that fuels this war, is that he was the firstborn, given a terrible and specific charge. Akatosh, having created time, knew it must also have an end. Alduin was created to be the reset button. He is the World Eater, the great serpent that would one day arrive to consume this version of reality, this Kalpa, allowing the next to begin. But not yet. Akatosh gave his firstborn dominion over the fledgling world of Mundus as its steward, its protector, until that final appointed day. And this gift, this pact with time, was the seed of all the tyranny to come. When the first men, the Atmorans, crossed the churning sea of ghosts from their dying, frozen homeland, they arrived in a land ruled by gods. They looked to the skies over the vast untamed wilderness that would one. This land was ruled by the dragons. Alduin and his brethren soared over the jagged peaks, their scales blotting out the sun. To these early Nords, who had just fled a continent of ice, these creatures were the ultimate expression of power. They were magnificent, terrible, and eternal, and in a classic case of if you can't beat 'em, worship 'em, the Nords did just that. This is the core in-game fact that underpins everything. The dragons were the original gods of mankind. This first relationship was not, perhaps, inherently cruel. It was the natural order. The strong ruled, the weak served. The dragons were the lords of the sky, the air, and the earth. The Nords built great sloping shrines of stone in their honour. They offered tribute, game, gold, perhaps even lives, to appease these timeless beings. A dragon's shadow passing overhead was a divine event, a reminder of who was truly in charge. The dragons, in their arrogance, accepted this as their due. They were, after all, pieces of a god. Why shouldn't they be worshipped? But Alduin, the World Eater, was not built for stewardship. His very soul was an engine of domination and consumption. His father had given him the world to watch, but Alduin decided to own it. His pride, a pride that only a timeless being can possess, swelled beyond all measure. He looked at the scurrying, short-lived mortals below and saw not subjects, but tools. He saw cattle. Why should he wait for the end of time to rule? Why not rule now? Alduin, in the grand tradition of firstborn children everywhere, immediately developed a superiority complex that would make a high elf blush. He began to twist the pact. The worship was no longer enough. He demanded absolute obedience. The other dragons, bound to him by their very nature, the strong always rule the weak in the dragon world, followed his lead. The stewardship of Akatosh curdled into a brutal tyranny. The shrines were not enough. Alduin demanded temples. The tribute was not enough. He demanded slavery. This was the dawn of the dragon cult. The shadow that passed overhead was no longer a sign of divinity. It was a threat. The roar that echoed through the valleys was not a song of power. It was the crack of a whip. Alduin, the firstborn, had rejected his father's purpose. He had chosen to pervert his role as World Eater and instead become a king, a tyrant god, feasting on the souls and the labour of mortals to fuel his own power. He would not be the end of the world. He would be the world. But this vast new empire of fear could not be managed by dragons alone. They were too few, too magnificent too, busy being timeless and arrogant. Alduin needed intermediaries. He needed mortals who would enforce his will, mortals who could bridge the gap between the divine and the subservient. He needed priests, and in the hearts of certain men, he found a hunger for power that mirrored his own. So, the World Eater needed a management team. He needed mortals willing to trade their fleeting, fragile lives for a taste of true, eternal power. And in the ambitious, the ruthless, and the devout, he found his candidates. These were not men who were simply coerced. They were men who aspired. They saw the dragons not as oppressors, but as the ultimate expression of reality. The strong rule, the weak serve. This was the dragon's creed, and it became theirs. This was the ultimate corporate ladder climb, from village shaman or tribal chieftain to demigod's personal assistant, with spectacular, soul-crushing benefits. This was the birth of the dragon cult, and at its very heart were the dragon priests. In exchange for their absolute unquestioning loyalty, the dragons bestowed upon these chosen mortals a sliver of their own divine might. This power was symbolized and in fact channeled through the giving of masks. This is the core in-game fact we all recognize, those terrifying floating visages that still haunt the ruins of Skyrim. Each mask was unique, a relic of immense power crafted by the dragons themselves. It was a badge of office, a tool of power, and ultimately a cage. When a priest donned his mask, he was no longer just a man. He was an extension of his master's will. The masks imbued them with knowledge of the Thu'um, granting them dominion over the elements. They could call down fire, summon storms of ice, or command the lightning. The masks also served another more practical purpose. They hid the terrible cost of the bargain. The power that flowed through the priests was a raw, timeless cosmic force. It was the power of Akatosh, filtered through the tyranny of Alduin. It was not meant for mortal bodies. It withered them, dried them out, and burned away their humanity, preserving them in a state of horrific, unending undeath. The mask became their true face, their rotting, mummified flesh hidden beneath the cold, impassive gold or ebony. Their retirement plan, it seems, was to be an angry, magically infused corpse in a box. And this leads to a fascinating fan debate. Was this undeath always the plan? Did the priests willingly sign up for an eternity as a magically potent lich, believing it was the only way to serve their masters forever? Or was it an unforeseen consequence, a terrible side effect of channeling divine energy? The lore suggests the former. The dragons are timeless. A mortal servant who dies in 60 years is a poor investment. The bargain, it seems, was for all of time. The priests willingly sacrificed their humanity, their very souls, for the promise of ruling at their master's side for eternity. With this new, terrifying clergy in place, the shift from reverent worship to absolute tyranny was swift and brutal. The dragons were the gods in the sky, but the dragon priests were the gods on the ground. They were the viceroys, the enforcers, the ones who translated a dragon's lazy, arrogant command into a brutal mortal reality. It's the ultimate. This meeting could have been an email, but the email is a fireball to the face, delivered by a guy who hasn't seen his own chin in a century. The cult established a rigid hierarchy. Alduin was the god king. His most powerful dragon lieutenants, whose names are now lost to all but the oldest stones, were his dukes and barons, ruling vast swaths of Tamriel. And beneath them, the dragon priests ruled the mortal herds. They established great imposing temples, dark edifices of stone built to channel and focus the power of their masters, and this is where we find an obscure lore tidbit that recontextualizes so much of what we find in Skyrim. The word walls, those ancient rune-carved stones we adventurers seek out, were not just history lessons. They were the cult's textbooks. They were the very focal points of the dragon's power, places where the language of the gods was etched into the world itself. It was here the dragons taught the priests, and the stones themselves resonated with the Thu'um, reinforcing their dominion over the land and its people. The laws of the dragon cult were simple. The dragons were gods. The priests were their voices. Mortals were slaves. The old ways of the Nords, their worship of the animal gods, the hawk, the wolf, the bear, were suppressed. Kyne, the warrior widow of Shor, was declared a pale shadow of Alduin's might. Shor himself, the god of mortals, was declared a great enemy, a dead trickster whose realm was a lie. This was the cult's most profound and terrible cruelty. Alduin, the World Eater, in his ultimate act of blasphemous arrogance, began to claim the souls of dead Nords. He perverted his divine purpose. Instead of eating the world at the end of time, he began to feast on the souls of its people in the present. He set himself up as the new gatekeeper of the afterlife. Sovngarde, the Hall of Valor, was now a place only he could grant access to, and he rarely did. He feasted on these captured souls, growing ever stronger, robbing the Nords not only of their lives, but of their deaths. The daily life of a Nord under the dragon cult became a living nightmare. They were forbidden from building permanent homes for themselves, forced to live in crude temporary settlements. All their skill, their labour, their lives were to be dedicated to one purpose, the glorification of the dragons. The priests demanded endless tithes, grain, livestock, gold, and children. They were a brutal, ever-present secret police, their masked faces the last thing any dissenter ever saw. Any murmur of rebellion, any prayer to the old gods was met with overwhelming, fiery retribution. The Nords were trapped, their spirits as crushed as their bodies, their very afterlives held hostage by a tyrant who claimed to be a god. And this tyrant demanded monuments. The dragons demanded monuments, and the dragon priests were all too eager to sign the work orders. Thus began the greatest, most brutal construction project in Tamriel's history. The Empire of Stone was to be built not just for the dragons, but by the Nords, a constant grinding reminder of their enslavement. Every quarry that was opened, every forest that was felled, and every stone that was laid was an act of forced worship. The Nords, a people known for their fierce independence and hardy spirit, were broken down into a massive continental-scale labour force. They were ants, building mountains for giants. This is the core in-game fact that defines the Skyrim landscape. When you, the Dragonborn, delve into a ruin like Bleak Falls Barrow, you are not just exploring a random dungeon, you are walking through a monument to this tyranny. These structures, which we now call barrows, crypts and ruins, were the temples, palaces and tombs of the dragon cult. They were seats of power, built on the highest peaks, closest to the heavens where their masters dwelled. They were designed to inspire awe and terror, their dark, dragon-mouthed entrances gaping open to swallow the sky, and of course to house the armies of Draugr. But they were more than just temples. They were the administrative centres of a continent-spanning slave empire. And at the heart of this empire, we find a truly obscure lore tidbit that most players walk right past. We all know the ruin called Labyrinthian, but few remember the small, unassuming ruin of Bromjunar just to the south. It is here that adventurers find a simple wooden mask which, when worn, transports the user back in time to the ruin's glory days. This small room, containing the shrines to all the major dragon priests, was the capital of the dragon cult. Bromjunar was the Vatican of this dark faith, the central command from which the priest kings issued their decrees. The priests would gather here, their grotesque, masked faces illuminated by cold, magical light, to coordinate the enslavement of an entire race. The construction itself was a rolling apocalypse. Imagine it! The harsh, unforgiving climate of the Merethic-era Skyrim. There were no heated carriages, no cosy inns, just unrelenting blizzards, howling winds, and the constant deafening roar of dragons overhead. Nords, men and women, were hauled from their villages and sent in chains to the mountains. They were given crude iron tools and set against the hardest granite. They died in droves. They were crushed by stone blocks the size of houses. They slipped from icy scaffolding and fell thousands of feet. They froze to death in the night, their bodies left to be buried by the snow, their souls a potential snack for the World Eater. This was a project that dwarfed the pyramids. The logistics were managed by the priests, but the heavy lifting was done by mortals. And let's be fair, there must have been some serious assistance. A few thousand Nords with pickaxes, no matter how motivated by terror, can't build something like the fortress of Skuldafn, perched impossibly in the Velothi Mountains, accessible only by air. The priests used their own stolen power, echoes of the Thu'um, to shape stone and bind the structures. The dragons themselves likely used their own shouts, their very voices carving out valleys and raising mountains. This wasn't just construction, it was a brutal form of terraforming. A bit like landscaping if your landscaper used genocide and divine magic to get the job done. The psychological toll was perhaps worse than the physical. These enslaved Nords were forced to carve the very symbols of their oppression. They etched the twisting draconic script onto the word walls, freezing their master's language of power into the rock. They built the elaborate puzzle-locked doors, mechanisms designed to keep them out. They crafted the sarcophagi, the stone beds where their tormentors, the dragon priests, would one day lie, dreaming their endless undead dreams. And worst of all, they built the sacrificial altars, the blood-stained stones where their friends and family might be executed for disobedience, or simply as a votive offering. And what of the greatest of these ruins? What of Labyrinthian? This brings us to a compelling fan theory. We know Labyrinthian in the Fourth Era as the place where the College of Winterhold sends its initiates for a final dangerous test. But the sheer scale of the place suggests a far grander, more sinister purpose. The community often debates what it was in the time of the dragons. The name itself, given by the later architects, is a clue. But the ruins beneath, the parts the mages didn't build, speak to something else. It was almost certainly a great nexus of cult power, a place where the most powerful priests convened. Was it a prison for unspeakable horrors? A dark university where new, terrible magics were devised? Or perhaps a grand arena where defiant Nords were forced to fight captured beasts for the dragon's amusement? The lore is silent, but the architecture screams of a place that held more than just dead priests. It was a place of dark creation, and perhaps a prison for a powerful rival. This empire of stone was rising. All across Skyrim, from the lowest valleys to the highest wind-blasted peaks, the mark of the dragon was being etched into the very bones of the world. Bleak Falls Barrow, Forelhost, Valthuum, Volskige, each one was a nail in the coffin of Nordic freedom. Each was a fortress, a palace, and a tomb, ready to receive its undead lord. The land was scarred, dominated, and prepared. The dragons had their castles, the priests had their thrones. Now, all that was left was to rule. The great stone temples were complete. The mountains of Skyrim were scarred with these monuments of fear, and now the dragon priests took their thrones. From these cold, windswept halls, they enacted their iron rule. The dragons themselves were a distant celestial terror, an ultimate threat that kept the world in line. But the priests were the immediate daily nightmare. They were the ones who walked among the mortals, their masked faces impassive, their power absolute. They were, in every practical sense, the kings of this new and terrible world. Each priest was a viceroy, granted dominion over a vast swath of Skyrim, and they ruled their territories as personal fiefdoms, with a cruelty as unique as the masks they wore. This is where we must talk about the core in-game fact that fills every ruin, the Draugr. We see them as little more than shambling, dusty skeletons who shout at us and are easily dispatched with a sword. But in the time of the cult, they were the grim reality of a Nord's life and death. The dragon cult perfected a system of control that was so absolute, it extended beyond the grave. The priests were not just rulers, they were master necromancers. They promised their most faithful followers eternal life in service to the dragons. These followers, the most devout and terrified of the Nords, would willingly submit to a ritual of mummification. They were entombed within the temples they had just built, believing they would awaken in a paradise. They were deceived. This brings us to a truly dark, obscure lore tidbit from the in-game text amongst the Draugr. This was not about an afterlife, it was about maintenance. The Draugr were not just sleeping, they were bound. Their life force, their very souls, were being slowly siphoned to sustain their masters. They were living batteries, trapped in their sarcophagi, their minds rotting over centuries, their only purpose to feed the priests undeath. They were only reanimated to serve, to tend the tombs, to clean the halls, and most importantly to rise and defend their master should the tomb be disturbed. This was the cult's retirement plan, an entire population of slaves, bound in life to build the temples, and bound in death to maintain them. It's the worst employee of the month program in history, where the reward is to be an angry, dusty janitor, forever. The priests themselves were terrifying in their specialization. Take, for example, the one known as Miraak, whose name literally translates to brutal. He ruled his domain from the Temple of Thu'um. He was not just a taskmaster, he was a master of plague and disease, a control freak of the highest, most sociopathic order. His obsession was not just with the souls of his followers, but with their bodies. He was a pioneer in a grotesque form of necromancy, experimenting with ways to make his servants more resilient. He believed that undeath was a messy, imperfect state. He sought to perfect it. He cultivated diseases, studied their effects, and then unleashed them upon his own populace to test their efficacy. His goal was to create a perfect, plague-ridden, controllable army. He was so terrifying that his own lieutenant, a man named Valdar, was forced to trap him in his own tomb and magically bind himself to stand guard for all eternity, just to keep Miraak's brutal plague from consuming the world. Then there were others, like Crosis, or Sorrow. When you find him in the game, he's at Sheer Point, a desolate wind-blasted peak guarding a word wall alongside a dragon. This tells us everything about the hierarchy. Crosis was not just a ruler of men, he was a trusted partner to a dragon, a guardian of the sacred language. His mask grants power to the stealthy, to alchemists, archers, and lockpickers. This was no brute force thug. Crosis was the spy master, the assassin, the shadow of the cult. He was the one who managed the quiet side of tyranny, the disappearances in the night, the poison in the well, the arrow from the dark. He was the one who ensured that even a whispered dissent far from a priest's temple would be met with a swift and silent end. He was almost certainly the one who stole the last sweet roll from the mead hall, and nobody was brave enough to question it. Daily life for the average Nord was a simple, repetitive horror. You would wake in your crude hut shivering. You would work the fields, not for your family, but for the local priest's tithe. You would quarry stone, not for a home, but for the priest's tomb. You would see your children inspected by the glowing, impassive eyes of a floating priest, checking them for strength. The strong ones would be taken for labour, the faithful ones would be taken for the Draugr initiation, and the rebellious ones, they would simply vanish. The air itself was thick with fear, the sky dominated by the ever-present shadow of a dragon wing, and the earth dominated by the priest who owned your body, your labour, and your soul. This council of monster priests, Miraak the scientist, Crosis the assassin, Miraak the wielder of magicka, Vokun the shadow, were a terrifying executive board. But they all answered to someone, and this leads us to one of the greatest fan theories and mysteries of the dragon cult. Who was Conaric? In Bromjunar, the capital, there is a final, golden mask. Its name means warlord. It can only be accessed by combining the power of all the other high priests. The identity of this archpriest is unknown. Was Conaric a title held by the high priest of the time? Was it Varlock, the priest we will soon meet, who was tasked with hunting down Miraak? Or was it a failsafe? The mask's enchantment is telling. When the wearer is near death, it has a chance to heal them and cast a devastating cloak of fire, knocking back enemies. This sounds less like a tyrant's tool and more like a last-ditch defense. The theory persists that Connaric was not the leader of the priests, but a secret, a final champion, perhaps even a mortal, designated to destroy the cult should they ever fail Alduin. The lore is silent, but what is certain is that this council of priest-kings with their iron rule had become the most hated and most powerful force in Tamriel. The Empire of Stone was complete, the priest-kings were enthroned, and the Nords were a broken people. They lived in a state of absolute grinding despair. Their bodies were chattel, their lives were forfeit at the whim of a masked tyrant, and most cruelly their deaths were a dead end. Alduin, the World Eater, sat like a bloated spider at the centre of a web of fear, feasting on their souls, denying them their rightful afterlife in Shaw's Hall. The old gods were forgotten, their shrines desecrated, their names whispered as curses if they were spoken at all. All hope, it seemed, had been extinguished, but one of the old gods had not forgotten them. Kyne, the warrior widow, the goddess of the storm, the wind, and the very sky itself. She watched from the heavens as Alduin, the firstborn of Akatosh, perverted his divine mandate. He had claimed her domain, the sky, and filled it with his roaring, arrogant brood. He had enslaved her people, the Nords, who were born of the wind and the cold, and in the ultimate act of blasphemy he was stealing the souls of her husband's people, blocking the path to Sovngarde. Her rage was a cold building storm, a pressure front accumulating over centuries waiting to break. The Aedra, the divines, were bound by ancient compacts. They could not simply step down onto Mundus and swat Alduin from the sky. Such a direct intervention would unravel the very fabric of reality they had sacrificed so much to create. But Kyne was a warrior goddess, and she was clever. If she could not strike the dragons herself, she would forge a weapon. She would give the ants the power to kill the giants, and so she looked down upon the enslaved Nords. She saw their crushed spirits, their hopeless toil. She saw the spark of defiance that still flickered, buried deep beneath the ice of their despair. She drew in a great cosmic breath, a breath that was the wind of the plains, the fury of the blizzard, and the cold, thin air of the highest peak, and she gave it to them. This gift, this sacred breath was the Thu'um. This is the core in-game fact of the entire rebellion. The Nords call it the Voice. It was the dragon's own weapon, their birthright, the very essence of their timeless power. But the dragons were fragments of Akatosh, the god of time. Kyne was the goddess of the sky and the air, the medium through which all sound, all voice must travel. She used her own divine nature as a conduit. She didn't invent the Thu'um, but she stole the knowledge of it and, crucially, gave mortals the capacity to wield it. She ripped the dragon's language from their throats and planted it as a seed of power in the souls of men. Imagine the scene. A slave, exhausted, stands in the driving snow of a great stone quarry. A dragon cultist, one of the lesser unmasked enforcers, strikes him with a whip. The Nord, in a final hopeless surge of rage, does not just cry out, he shouts. And the cultist is not just staggered, he is hurled backwards, his body torn apart by a force he cannot comprehend. The slave looks at his hands, his throat raw, tasting the ozone of impossible power. The other slaves stop, their crude tools falling from frozen fingers. For the first time, a mortal has spoken in the tongue of the gods, and the world has listened. This is where we find a beautiful, obscure lore tidbit that many players miss. The Nords didn't call this the Thu'um, not at first. They called it the Storm Voice, a gift from their storm goddess, Kyne. This is why, in the Fourth Era, the Greybeards are said to speak for Kyne. It is why their monastery, High Hrothgar, is built near the summit of the Throat of the World, a place sacred to her. The way of the voice, the philosophy of peace and balance that the Greybeards espouse, is not a draconic philosophy. It is a philosophy of Kyne, an attempt to master the violent gift she gave them. The reaction from the dragon cult was not just anger, it was sheer, unadulterated panic. This was not just a rebellion, this was blasphemy of the highest order. It was as if the cattle had learned to use the butcher's knives. A single mortal with the storm voice could shatter a draugr, break a stone wall, or even annoy a dragon. And if one mortal could do it, how many more would follow? The priests, in their cold, undead arrogance, had believed themselves completely untouchable. Now, for the first time, they felt a sliver of something they had not felt in millennia: fear. It was a cold, unfamiliar sensation, like a forgotten memory of their own mortality. They probably griped about it in their next executive meeting at Bromjunar. The assets are becoming vocal. This is terrible for our quarterly soul harvest. This divine intervention, of course, raises a profound community debate. Did Kyne act alone? Or was this part of a deeper game played by the dead god, Shor? Shor, the god of mortals, was defeated during the creation of the world, his heart ripped out and thrown into Mundus. He is the Nords' chief deity, and Sovngarde is his hall. Alduin, by stealing mortal souls, was directly challenging Shor's dominion, even in death. The fan theory holds that Kyne, as Shor's widow, acted on his behalf. Shor, ever the trickster, could not act directly, but he could influence events through his wife and his people. He was the spark of defiance in the Nords. Kyne simply provided the means, the voice, to unleash it. The Dragon War, therefore, was not just a mortal rebellion. It was a proxy war, fought by mortals on behalf of their dead god against the tyrant who had usurped his throne. The gift of the storm voice spread. It was a whisper at first, a secret passed in the slave pits and the frozen quarries. It was a raw, untamed power. Most who tried to use it were destroyed by it, their bodies torn apart by the uncontrolled forces. It was a weapon they did not know how to aim. But it was a weapon. The Nords, for the first time since the Atmarans landed, had hope. They had a god fighting for them. The tyranny of the dragons was no longer absolute. The first spark of the rebellion had been lit, and now it just needed someone to fan it into a flame. Kyne's gift was a spark in the dark, a secret weapon slowly spreading among the enslaved. The Nords had the potential for the Thu'um, but it was a raw, wild, and dangerous power. It was the howl of the storm, not the focused, cutting word of a master. As the priests of the dragon cult began to sense this new, strange magic among their cattle, they grew fearful. But their fear was about to be compounded by a threat from within their own ranks. While the Nords were just learning to whisper in the storm voice, one mortal had already mastered the dragon's tongue. He hadn't been taught by Kyne, he was born with it. His name was Miraak, and he was a dragon priest. But he was something more. This is the core, in-game fact that defines his entire story. Miraak was the first Dragonborn. He was a mortal man, born with the soul of a dove, a dragon. This made him unique in all of Tamriel. The dragon cult, upon discovering this anomaly, must have seen him as the ultimate prize, the perfect bridge between the mortal and the divine. Here was a man who could speak their language innately, who understood their power, who could absorb the souls of slain dragons and steal their knowledge. He rose through their ranks with blinding speed, becoming one of the most powerful and trusted priests in the entire cult. He was given a mask, a high seat in their councils, and dominion over the island of Solstheim. He was by all accounts the perfect servant. But the soul of a dragon does not serve, it rules. Miraak's pride was as boundless as that of his scaled masters. He looked at Alduin and the other dragons, and he did not feel reverence. He felt rivalry. He saw himself as their equal, perhaps even their superior. He was a dragon, trapped in the convenient, versatile body of a man. He served, he bowed, he obeyed, but he was biding his time, looking for a weakness. He was, in essence, the ultimate ambitious middle manager, plotting to overthrow the entire board of directors. This burning, secret ambition was a beacon in the darkness, and it attracted the attention of a being far older and more insidious than Alduin. From the black, swirling chaos of oblivion, an eye turned. Hermaeus Mora, the Daedric Prince of Knowledge and Fate, the cosmic squid librarian of the endless dusty stacks, saw this mortal dragon hybrid and coveted him. Mora didn't care about tyranny or freedom, or the plight of the Nords. He cared about knowledge, particularly forbidden, secret knowledge that could unravel the threads of reality. And Miraak was a seeker. This is where we find a truly obscure lore tidbit, the source of Miraak's rebellion. Hermaeus Mora did not just appear to him. He whispered, he tempted, he left a breadcrumb trail of power. He led Miraak to one of his artifacts, a black book. When Miraak opened it, he was transported to the swirling, tentacle-filled realm of Apocrypha. Here, Mora struck his bargain. He offered Miraak the one piece of knowledge that Alduin kept from all mortals, and even from his own priests, a Thu'um of ultimate blasphemous power. It was a shout of 3 words, Z, Los, D. Spirit, mind, you. The Ben-Will shout. This was not a shout of fire or ice. It did not kill, it enslaved. It was a word of power that could shatter the will of a dragon, severing its loyalty to Alduin and binding it to Miraak. This was the ultimate weapon. It turned the cult's greatest strength against itself. Armed with this terrible secret, Miraak's ambition crystallized into a plan. He would not just serve the dragons, he would replace them. He returned to Solstheim and began his own secret rebellion. He built his great temple high in the mountains. He used his power and charisma to sway mortals to his own cause, creating a rival cult. These followers liberated the Nords of Solstheim from the dragon cult, only to immediately re-enslave them to him. For the common man, it was just a change in management from one set of masked tyrants to another. Miraak then began to openly defy his masters. He used bend will to create his own personal flight of dragons. He hunted down those who resisted, devoured their souls, and grew stronger. It was a schism, a civil war within the cult itself. This naturally sparks a major community debate. Was Miraak ever a good guy? Was he a flawed hero, a proto-rebel for humanity? The overwhelming evidence and the general fan consensus is a resounding no. Miraak was not a liberator. He was a usurper. He never intended to free the Nords. He intended to own them. He saw Alduin's empire and simply thought, I could do that better. He was just as arrogant, just as cruel, and just as power-hungry as the tyrant he sought to overthrow. The war between Miraak and the dragon cult was brutal, but it was separate from the Nords' burgeoning rebellion. This was a high-level corporate dispute, fought with shouts that tore the sky apart. Dragons fought dragons, their bodies crashing onto the snowy peaks of Solstheim. Miraak, at the head of his new army, was a god in his own right, his power swelling with every dragon soul he consumed. But he had made a critical error. He had mistaken the knowledge of a Daedric prince for his loyalty, and he had underestimated the sheer, raw power of the existing regime. Alduin, furious at this betrayal, dispatched his own champion, a powerful priest named Varlock, to destroy the traitor. The 2 dragon priests met in a battle that was said to have lasted for days, a cataclysm of magic and Thu'um that literally tore the island of Solstheim from the mainland of Skyrim. Miraak, for all his power, was losing. Varlock, the jailer, was relentless. As the final, killing blow was about to be struck, Miraak found himself on the precipice of true death, and Hermaeus Mora made his move. The Daedric prince was not about to let his new prized possession be destroyed. Just as Varlock's weapon fell, Mora pulled his champion's soul from Mundus, yanking him fully into the realm of Apocrypha. Miraak's temple was torn from the earth, and he himself was impaled on a spike of dark knowledge, a prisoner guest of the Daedric prince for the next 4,000 years. Back in Tamriel, Miraak was gone. His rebellion had failed. The dragon cult had won. Varlock was named his jailer, set to watch over his empty, ruined temple for eternity, awaiting a return that would not come. The cult erased Miraak's name from their records, but the damage was done. Miraak had proven 2 world-shattering facts. 1, a mortal could challenge the dragons. 2, dragons could be killed. Miraak's rebellion was over before it truly began. It was a palace coup, a high-stakes corporate takeover that failed, and its only result was the traitor being transferred to the Apocrypha branch for an eternity of sorting Hermaeus Mora's unspeakable library. For the common Nord, nothing had changed. In fact, things arguably got worse. The dragon cult, having rooted out one traitor, clamped down with renewed paranoid fury. Their rule became even more suffocating. They had proven they could defeat a Dragonborn. Their power seemed once again unassailable, but Miraak had proven that dragons could be defied, and Kyne's gift of the Storm Voice was still a seed of hope, buried in the frozen earth of the Nords' despair. The people had the raw power, but they lacked the knowledge to wield it. Their shouts were bursts of uncontrolled rage, like a child setting off an explosion. They were dangerous, yes, but mostly to themselves. They could not stand against the focused, ancient, terrible Thu'um of a true dragon priest, let alone a dragon. They had the bullets, but no gun. They needed a teacher. And in one of the most profound, reality-bending twists in Tamriel's history, they got one. He didn't come from the enslaved mortals, or from the gods. He came from the very heart of the tyranny itself. His name was Paarthurnax. This is the core in-game fact that every Dragonborn learns at the throat of the world. Paarthurnax was not just a dragon. He was Alduin's brother. He was the Firstborn's most trusted lieutenant, his second in command, the vice president of oppression. Paarthurnax was there from the beginning. His claws were stained with the blood of the first Atmarans. His voice had helped command the enslaved. His shadow had helped blot out the sun. He was, by his own admission, one of the greatest architects of the dragon cult's tyranny. If Alduin was the CEO, Paarthurnax was the COO, the one who actually made the trains run on time, ensuring the soul quotas were met. So, what happened? Why would the second most powerful dragon in existence, a being who benefited immeasurably from the system, turn against it? The answer is not simple. It was not a sudden burst of morality. It was a slow, agonizing process of self-realization that lasted for centuries. Dragons, as we know, are not just lizards. They are fragments of time. Their very nature, their dove essence, is to dominate. Pride, ambition, and the will to rule are not just personality traits for them. They are the fundamental components of their souls. This is what Paarthurnax means when he says Zoc Freni Groot, most foul betrayal. To him, betraying Alduin was not just a political act. It was an act of betraying his own nature, and yet he did it. While Alduin and the priests grew fat and arrogant on the souls of mortals, Paarthurnax, it seems, began to think. He retired to the very peak of the throat of the world, the highest, most isolated point in all of Tamriel, a place where the wind howls and the fabric of the sky feels thin, and there he meditated. He sat, coiled on the stone for uncounted mortal lifetimes. He wrestled with his own innate drive to dominate. He saw his brother, Alduin, perverting his divine mandate. The World Eater was meant to end the world, not own it. Alduin's infinite arrogance, as Paarthurnax would later call it, had become a flaw, a deep crack in the perfection of the dove. This is where we find the obscure lore tidbit that forms the basis of the Greybeard's entire philosophy. Paarthurnax, in his long contemplation, developed a new way of being. He created a personal philosophy of control, a mantra to overcome his own soul. He called it Teed, Aran, Drem. Time, grace, peace. It was a way of using the Thu'um not to conquer the world, but to conquer the self. He learned to balance his eternal, timeless nature with the present moment. He learned to control the fire within him, to let his rage pass, to choose a different path. It was, as he would say, a daily, unending struggle. It's the most intense form of counting to 10 in the history of the universe. And so, when Kyne's gift began to echo up the mountain, these faint, raw shouts of defiance from the slaves below, Paarthurnax made his choice. He descended. We must pause to imagine that scene. The first Nords who were practicing the storm voice in secret, perhaps a small band hiding in a remote cave, hear the beat of wings. They run, but they are too slow. A dragon, one of the great ones, lands before them, his scales the colour of the mountain stone, his eyes ancient and full of a terrible light. They prepare to die. This is Paarthurnax, the brother of Alduin. It's over. And then he speaks. Not to command, not to burn, but to teach. He offers them the one thing Miraak had hoarded, knowledge. He teaches them the words. He shows them how to shape their raw, violent storm voice into a true Thu'um. He gives them Fus, Force, Fim, Fade, and Yol Fire. He teaches them the structure, the grammar, the art of the dragon's tongue. He leaks the cult's most proprietary secrets to the rebellion. This act, this great betrayal, is the subject of one of Skyrim's most bitter community debates. Can Paarthurnax be forgiven? Is he truly reformed? The Blades, millennia later, would argue no. They see him as a war criminal who got a plea deal. They argue that his nature is immutable, a dragon is domination, and his meditation is just a long, patient game. They believe he's simply biding his time, another tyrant in waiting. But the Greybeards, and many players, see the truth of his struggle. They see a being actively fighting his own nature, choosing goodness every single day for thousands of years. The game forces this moral quandary on the player. Do you kill the teacher, the reformed sinner, because of the crimes he committed in the distant past. For the Nords of the Dragon War, this philosophical debate was irrelevant. They didn't care about his immortal soul, they cared that he was giving them weapons. Paarthurnax's defection was the single most important event of the war. It was the moment the rebellion went from a hopeless, scattered insurgency to a true, organised and capable army. Kyne had given them the spark. Miraak had proven the enemy was vulnerable, but Paarthurnax gave them the fire. He began to train the first true masters of the Thu'um, the ones whose names would soon be legends sung in the mead halls of a future free Skyrim. Paarthurnax, the great traitor, had become the first teacher. From his lonely, wind-scoured perch on the throat of the world, he passed on the secret of the Thu'um to the mortals below. But he could not teach everyone. The voice is a power that requires immense discipline, innate strength, and a will of iron. To learn it as a mortal is to risk being torn apart by the very power you seek to command. Most of Kyne's gifted would never be more than dabblers. Their shouts a glorified and very loud party trick. Paarthurnax needed true students. He needed a vanguard. And among the enslaved Nords, 3 individuals emerged, their potential shining like stars in the dark. They were not the first to use the storm voice, but they were the first to truly master it. They became the first tongues, a title that would soon be spoken in hushed awe by their allies and in terrified curses by the dragon cult. This is the core, in-game fact that sits at the heart of the war. The rebellion was led by a triumvirate of heroes. We see their statues in the Hall of Valor in Sovngarde, and we meet their souls in the mist, still waiting for the final battle. They were Hakon One-Eye, Gormleth Golden-Hilt, and Feldir the Old. First was Hakon One-Eye. He was the warrior, the personification of the Nordic ideal of strength. He was a mountain of a man, scarred and grizzled, having lost an eye in the quarries, or perhaps in an early failed skirmish with a Draugr. His rage was a blunt, simple, and overwhelming force. When Paarthurnax began to teach him, Hakon took to the shouts of pure power as if he were born to them. He wasn't much for the subtle philosophies of Tid, Aran, Drem. His philosophy was simpler. Hit the enemy, and if the enemy is a dragon, hit him with a shout first to make him land. He was the rebellion's battering ram. His unrelenting force was said to be able to shatter the great stone doors of a barrow from 100 paces. He was the one who would lead the charges, his one good eye blazing, his axe in hand, his voice a roar of pure, joyous defiance. Then came Gormleth Golden-Hilt. If Hakon was the rebellion's strength, Gormleth was its fury. She was a warrior poet, a skald of the blade, and her hatred for the cult was a white-hot, articulate fire. She had likely seen her family, her entire village consumed by the cult's cruelty, perhaps sacrificed on an altar or taken for the Draugr thraldom. Her grief had been forged into an unbreakable, razor-sharp edge. She was a dervish on the battlefield, her golden-hilted sword a blur. She mastered the shouts of speed and combat, whirlwind sprint and elemental fury, using them to move like lightning, her voice and her blade striking as one. She was the one who danced through the ranks of Draugr, a whirlwind of steel and sound, her shouts becoming the battle cries that inspired thousands to follow. She was the firebrand, the charismatic champion, the one who reminded them why they fought. And finally there was Feldir the Old. He was not a brute like Hakon or a fury like Gormleth. He was the mind. He was called the Old, not necessarily for his age, but for his wisdom. He was the one who saw the patterns, the one who understood the cost. He was the one who likely sat with Paarthurnax the longest, not just learning the words, but learning the enemy. He understood the dragon's nature, their arrogance, their reliance on their timeless power. Feldir was the one who devised the strategies. He was the one who figured out how to use the terrain, how to set traps, how to turn the cult's own tomb fortresses against them. His favoured shout was Clear Skies, a seemingly simple tool, but one he used to strip dragons of their cover, to clear the blizzards their masters summoned, and to expose them to the arrows and shouts of the Nordic armies. These 3 were the first true masters, the ones immortalised in the obscure lore tidbit of the in-game song The Hero of Sovngarde. Hakon and Feldir and Gormleth the Bold. Paarthurnax's lessons must have been intense. Today's lesson is Yol or fire. Please try not to incinerate your classmates. You'll need them for the apocalypse. This raises a critical fan debate. How did these 3 get so good, so fast? dragons and priests had millennia to practice. These three had, what, a few years, a decade? How did they become powerful enough to challenge the ancient masters of the Thu'um? The lore is sparse, but the theories are compelling. One suggests Paarthurnax did more than just teach, that he used his own draconic nature to somehow imprint the knowledge deep within their souls. A more popular theory is that Kyne's blessing was not just a key, but an accelerant. She had chosen these three champions, and her divine power made them prodigies, their mortal souls acting as superconductors for the Thu'um. Their raw, mortal rage, focused by Paarthurnax's wisdom, allowed them to achieve in months what took others centuries. They weren't just learning, they were remembering a power their goddess had just given them. Down from the mountain they came, no longer a trio of students, but an organised front. They were the tongues, and they became the living gods of the rebellion, the answer to the dragon priests. They travelled from village to village, from slave pit to quarry, and they didn't just fight, they taught. They passed on their knowledge, creating a small but elite corps of lesser tongues, captains and shock troopers for the new army. The war had changed. It was no longer a scattered, hopeless uprising. It was a true, organised continental conflict. The Nords, for the first time, were not just surviving, they were hunting. The dragons, who had seen mortals as ants, were now being shot out of the sky by a synchronised shout from a dozen tongues. The dragon priests, who had ruled for eternity from their stone thrones, now found their tombs under siege, their Draugr armies, shattered by a disarmed shout, and their own fireballs smothered by a frost breath counter-shout. The tongues led the first great victories. They liberated the valleys, they stormed the lower, less significant dragon temples. They were brilliant, they were powerful, and they were winning. But they were also mortal, and they were about to face an enemy that was not just a priest, but a fellow master of the voice, one whose battle with Miraak had already shattered a continent. The war was about to find its bloodiest battleground. The rebellion had its champions. Hakon, Gormleth and Feldir, now masters of the Thu'um, were carving a path of liberation through the valleys of Skyrim. The dragon cult, for the first time in millennia, was on the defensive. Their Draugr forces were being shattered, their lesser priests were being overwhelmed, and their dragon masters were being forced to actually fight for their lives, a deeply insulting turn of events for them. The Nords, empowered by Kyne and trained by Paarthurnax, were a true existential threat. The situation was, for the first time, not entirely in the dragon's favour. But this was not the only fire Alduin had to put out. As the tongues were leading their revolution on the mainland, that other, more personal betrayal was still festering on the island of Solstheim. Miraak, the first Dragonborn, the traitor priest, was still running his rival empire, still backed by the creeping, tentacled power of Hermaeus Mora. This was a war on two fronts. The mainland Nords were a populist uprising, an insurgency. Miraak was a schism, a civil war. Alduin, in his infinite arrogance, could not tolerate either, but the Solstheim problem was an open, infected wound in his own hierarchy. He needed to cauterize it, and fast, so he could turn his full, undivided attention to his traitorous brother and the roaring mortals he was training. He needed an enforcer. He needed his most loyal, most powerful, and most unwavering champion. He needed the priest whose will was as singular and brutal as Alduin's own. He called upon Varlock, the jailer. This is the obscure lore tidbit that forms the entire basis of Solstheim's post-war state, found in the in-game book The Guardian and The Traitor. Varlock was not just a dragon priest. He was perhaps the most powerful of the loyalists. His name, Jailer, may have been prophetic, or it may have been a title he'd already earned by keeping other, lesser horrors in check. He was the one Alduin trusted to destroy the ultimate traitor, the one who had dared to bend will and steal the cult's own dragons. The confrontation was inevitable, and it would be a battle for the ages. Miraak, from his great temple, had become a god-king in his own right. His power, fueled by stolen dragon souls and the dark, forbidden knowledge of Apocrypha, was immense. He was a Dragonborn, and he commanded dragons of his own. He was, in his own mind, the new Alduin. Varlock, by contrast, was pure, unadulterated Dov loyalty. He was the regime, the establishment, the unbending fist of the old way. He arrived on Solstheim not to parley but to execute, and so the duel began. It was not a clash of swords, not at first, it was a war of the voice. Miraak, perched on his temple, unleashed his foul green-black shouts, the very words of Hermaeus Mora. He likely opened with his ultimate weapon, Z, Los, D. Mind, spirit, you. The bend will shout, designed to shatter the will of any being, dragon or mortal, and turn it into a puppet. He had used it to build his army. He now used it to destroy Alduin's champion, and it failed. This is the great fan debate of the battle. How did Varlock resist? How did a mere priest, even a powerful one, defy a shout that could tame a dragon? The texts are silent, but the implication is powerful. Varlock's will was not his own to be bent. His loyalty to Alduin was so absolute, so perfect, that it formed an unbreakable shield. He was Alduin's will. You cannot steal what is not there. Or perhaps, Varlock simply counter-shouted, his own Fusrodar meeting Miraak's dark words in midair, a concussion of pure power that shook the very stones. He may not have been Dragonborn, but he was a master, and he had the full ancient power of the cult at his back. The duel was joined. Varlock, seeing his enemy was not a mere mortal but a true rival, descended. The two priests, floating demigods of terrible power, met in the skies above Solstheim. For days the island was torn apart. The Nords and cultists who had been enslaved by Miraak could only hide in caves and cellars as the heavens burned. The ground heaved. The sound, a constant rolling Dovar Kyne versus Fusrodar, was a deafening, reality-bending roar. This is the core in-game fact that defines the battle. Their power was too great for the world to contain. This was not a skirmish. It was a clash of divine forces. Miraak channeled the twisting, chaotic, infinite power of Apocrypha. Varlock channeled the rigid, absolute, timeless power of the dragons. The shouts they hurled at each other were not just gouts of fire and ice. They were words that unmade creation. They were screaming at the world, change versus stay, and the world broke. In the climax of their battle, the two masters unleashed their ultimate attacks simultaneously. The resulting explosion, a cataclysm of pure Thu'um, did not just level the mountainside. It struck the very bedrock of Tamriel. The land bridge connecting Solstheim to the mainland of Skyrim, a great span of earth and rock, shattered. The sea, in its fury, rushed into the new gap. The island of Solstheim was violently, catastrophically sundered from the continent. The Nords on the shore of Skyrim could only look on in horror as the horizon was remade by the rage of two men. It's the most dramatic "you're breaking up with me" in history, where the continent itself does the breaking up. But even in this cataclysm, Varlock was winning. Miraak, for all his Daedric gifts, was still arrogant. He was a rebel. Varlock was purpose. He was a jailer. He was relentless, a walking engine of pure loyalty. He battered Miraak from the sky, his shouts overwhelming the traitor's dark magic. Miraak's mask was cracked. His body was broken. He was defeated. Varlock stood over the first Dragonborn, his weapon raised for the final soul-ending blow, and Miraak, in his final desperate second, did not pray to Alduin. He called to his true master, Hermaeus Mora, the Daedric prince of knowledge was not about to lose his most valuable asset. Just as Varlock's blow fell, the world dissolved. The sky over Solstheim turned to black ink. Great swirling tentacles of pure immaterial knowledge erupted from the ground, impaling Miraak's body. But they were not killing him. They were pulling him. Hermaeus Mora reached across the veil and stole his champion, yanking his soul from Mundus and pulling it into the dark, endless library of Apocrypha. Miraak's mortal body dissolved into a shower of black pages, his shout echoing as he was dragged into oblivion. Varlock stood victorious, but his enemy was gone. The traitor had escaped true death, spirited away by a Daedric lord. The rebellion on Solstheim was over. The cult had won. Varlock's victory was absolute, and for his reward Alduin gave him a new eternal duty. He was, in truth, the jailer. He was commanded to stand guard over Miraak's empty, ruined temple, to watch and wait for his return. Varlock, ever loyal, accepted. He and his followers entombed themselves in a great new prison crypt, a sleepless guard for an enemy who would not return for 4,000 years. The cult had closed its second front. It was a costly, brutal victory. But now, with Miraak gone and Varlock on guard duty, Alduin and his remaining priests could turn their full, undivided and furious attention to the mainland. The real war had just begun, with the Solstheim Schism brutally cauterized by Varlock and the traitor Miraak rotting in a cosmic library for the next few millennia. Alduin's regime could finally focus its full, terrifying power on the mainland. The war, for them, had been a two-front annoyance. Now it was a single, concentrated campaign of extermination. The rebellion, led by Haakon, Gormlath and Feldir, had been making incredible progress, but they were about to face the full, undivided attention of the entire dragon cult. The dragons, now genuinely angered, attacked in coordinated, overwhelming waves. The tongues were masters, but they were still mortal. They were winning battles, but the war was looking grim. And they faced a fundamental logistical nightmare. This is the core in-game fact that Paarthurnax himself explains. Dragons are not truly killed. You can break their bodies, but their souls are eternal. And Alduin, as the World Eater, had the ultimate cheat code. He could resurrect them. The Nords would fight a bloody, desperate battle to bring down a great dragon, losing dozens of warriors in the process, only for Alduin to fly over the skeletal remains days later, shout Slentid Vo, flesh time undo, and the monster would tear itself from the earth, good as new. The dragons were running an infinite respawn cheat, and the Nords were stuck in permadeath mode. Feldir the Old, the great strategist, knew this was unsustainable. They could not win a war of attrition against an enemy who could not be attrited. They were not just fighting dragons, they were fighting time itself. They had the voice, but they were using the dragon's own language. They were shouting fire at beings made of fire. They needed something the dragons didn't have. They needed a weapon that didn't just break a dragon's body, but broke its spirit. They needed to find a way to make the eternal temporary. The three heroes, Haakon, Gormlath and Feldir, made the long, secret journey back up the throat of the world. They went to their teacher, Paarthurnax, and laid out the problem. They needed a shout, they explained, to force the dragons to land. They needed to pull them from the sky. Paarthurnax, coiled on his meditation stone, listened, and for the first time the great ancient traitor dragon was forced to admit his own failure. He could not help them. This is the central, mind-bending, obscure lore tidbit about the Thu'um. A dragon cannot understand the concept of mortality. It is not in their nature. Their language, the Thu'um, is a language of actuality. When they speak, they are stating a fact, and reality bends to make it a fact. They have no words for maybe, if, hope, or end. They are timeless. They are. How, Paarthurnax asked, could he possibly teach them a word for something he could not comprehend? To try and speak of mortality in the dragon tongue would be a logical paradox, an impossibility. The word for it simply did not exist. The three tongues were devastated. Their greatest weapon, their teacher, had failed them. They were alone. But Feldir the Old, in a moment of mortal human genius, saw the answer. If the dragon's language had no such word, they would invent one. This was the single most radical act of the entire war. They were not just creating a new weapon, they were about to commit an act of conceptual linguistic blasphemy. They, mortals, were going to add a word to the language of the gods. They retired to a windswept cliff far from Paarthurnax, who perhaps could not even bear to listen, and they began to think. They did not meditate on timelessness and power as the dragons did. They meditated on their reality. They channeled all of their mortal human fragility. They thought of the villages burned to ash, the friends who had died, the frozen bodies in the snow. They thought of old age, of sickness, of the cold, hard end that awaited every one of them. They took all their pain, their grief, their rage and their fear, and they tried to forge it into a word of power. And this is where a compelling fan theory comes in. How did they do this? How did three mortals, no matter how gifted, invent a concept so powerful it could cripple a fragment of a god? The theory suggests they were not in fact alone. Kyne had given them the voice, but it was Shor, the dead god of mortals, who gave them the word. Shor, the god of the underworld, the ultimate embodiment of mortality, who was being cheated of his souls by Alduin. It is believed that he, from his dead throne in Sovngarde, whispered this final, terrible secret into Feldir's mind. It was the ultimate mortal weapon, gifted by the god of mortals. They forged three words of pure, concentrated mortal spite, Jur, Za, Frul. These words are anathema. To a dragon, they are the foulest curse, a string of pure logical nonsense. Jur means mortal, Za means finite, Frul means temporary. When a mortal shouts these words, they are not just speaking, they are imposing their own, flawed, temporary reality onto a being of eternal perfect existence. They are screaming, "You will end," at a creature whose entire soul is built on the fact that it cannot. When a dragon hears this shout, it is not just forced to land, it is crippled. It is a blast of pure conceptual agony. It is, for the first time, forced to comprehend its own death. It is hit with the crushing existential weight of 1 billion mortal lives, the entire concept of an end, all at once. It's a conceptual "I can't even" that brings them crashing to the ground, reeling in horror and confusion. They are, for a few precious moments, just as mortal and just as afraid as the tiny Nords standing over them. They called this shout Dragonrend. The first test must have been spectacular. A great ancient dragon, perhaps one of Alduin's chief lieutenants, descends on the tongues, its maw open in an arrogant roar of Yoltur Shul, fire inferno sun. Gormleth, golden hilt in her righteous fury, steps forward and hurls this new impossible word at it. Jor, Za, Frul. The dragon's fire breath chokes in its throat. Its arrogant roar becomes a high-pitched, uncomprehending shriek of terror. The creature, a god of the sky, suddenly forgets how to fly. It thrashes, its wings folding, its body seized by a pain it has never known, the pain of fear. It plummets from the sky, crashing into the earth with a sound like a mountain collapsing, skidding to a halt, wounded, dazed, and for the first time, grounded. Hakon One-Eye, his axe already in hand, would have turned to the others with a single, grim and victorious nod. The rules of the war had just been rewritten. The gods were no longer safe in the heavens. The Nords had found a way to drag them down to earth, to look them in the eye, and to teach them the very human art of dying. Dragonrend. It was a curse, a concept weapon, a 3-word-long existential crisis, and it changed everything. The dragons, who had ruled for millennia from the untouchable safety of the sky, were now vulnerable. The Nords, for the first time, had a weapon that the dragons not only didn't possess, but couldn't even comprehend. The scales, so long tipped in favour of the divine, had just been violently balanced by the weight of mortal ingenuity. The war entered its bloody peak. The battles that followed were not the scattered, desperate skirmishes of the early rebellion. They were organised, brutal, and, for the first time, winnable for the Nords. Picture a valley, choked with snow. A Nordic army, thousands strong, marches on a dragon cult temple, let's say Thu'um, the seat of Miraak. The Nords are a sea of iron and fur, their axes sharp, their spirits high. Above, the storm clouds break and a flight of dragons descends, led by a great bronze-scaled ancient. In the old days, this would have been a massacre. The Nords would have broken and fled, picked off one by gouts of fire. But now, they stand their ground. At the front, Gormleth Golden Hilt, Feldir the Old, and Hakon One-Eye look to the sky. As the lead dragon opens its maw to unleash its Thu'um, Gormleth screams hers first. Jor! Za! Frul! The blue, ethereal energy of the shout lances into the dragon. Its fire breath dies with a wet, choked gurgle. The roar of a god becomes a shriek of pure mortal terror. The Nords on the ground hear it, and their own roar of victorious rage doubles. The dragon thrashes, its wings flapping uselessly, its mind consumed by a new, impossible concept. It crashes into the snow, a god reduced to a panicked, thrashing lizard. Before it can even reorient, before it can even understand the why of its fall, Hakon One-Eye is upon it. Ha! His walkery echoes, and he leads the charge, his axe the first to bite into the dragon's scaled hide. Hundreds of Nords swarm the creature, climbing its body, hacking at its wings, plunging spears into its eyes. It is a bloody, horrific and intimate slaughter. The dragon is killed not by magic but by 1,000 mortal wounds, its eternal soul sent shrieking back to Akatosh as its body is torn apart. This scene was repeated all across Skyrim. The Nords, led by the tongues, were dragging the gods from the heavens and butchering them in the mud. The sheer, Visceral hatred of the enslaved, unleashed after centuries of oppression, was a terrible thing to behold. The dragon priests in their cold tombs panicked. Their ultimate weapon, the aerial superiority of their masters, was neutralized. This is the core in-game fact that defined this phase of the war. The priests themselves had to enter the fight. They could no longer sit on their thrones and send their Draugr. They donned their terrible masks, gathered their armies of undead, and met the Nords in open battle on the ground. The war became a grinding, bloody stalemate. The tongues, Harkon, Gormla, and Feldir, were now locked in duels of the Thu'um with the priests. It was fire against fire, frost against frost, a war of magic and voice that tore the mountainsides apart. The cost was astronomical. For every dragon the tongues grounded, for every priest they managed to seal in a tomb, thousands of Nords died. The cult, in its desperation, enacted horrific reprisals. They burned entire villages to the ground, salting the earth. They performed mass sacrifices, hoping to appease Alduin and regain his favour. The land was scarred, not just by battle, but by a spiteful, genocidal rage. This was not a clean war. It was an apocalypse. We see a glimpse of this desperation in the obscure lore tidbits surrounding the fortress of Forelhost, the stronghold of the priest Ragot. As the Nords, led by a great hero, who may or may not have been one of the Central Three, laid siege to the fortress, Ragot and his followers were trapped, but they did not surrender. This was a war of religious fanaticism, and the cultists believed in their gods. Rather than be captured, Ragot ordered a mass suicide. The entire population of Forelhost, men, women, and children, drank a potent poison, their bodies still littering the halls when you, the Dragonborn, arrive millennia later. Ragot himself was entombed, guarded by his last remaining Draugr, a testament to the hopeless fanatic zeal of the cult. They would rather die and serve their masters in undeath than live in a world ruled by mortals. This bloody reality leads to a key fan debate. Was this truly a war against all dragons? The term dragon war is a bit of a misnomer. Paarthurnax's defection proves that not all dragons were loyal to Alduin. The community often argues it should be called the Dragon Cult War. The Nords were not, at this stage, trying to render an entire species extinct. They were fighting a regime. Dragonrend was the perfect tool for this. It didn't just kill, it tested. A dragon who was not arrogant, who was not a tyrant, might not be so susceptible. It was a weapon that targeted pride as much as it targeted the dragon itself. This was a political revolution, writ in fire and blood, against a specific tyrannical government. But that government, though reeling, was not yet broken. The Nords had won the valleys. They had taken the low-lying temples. They had pushed the remaining priests back to their high mountain fortresses. But Alduin, the World Eater, the King of Kings, was still untouched. He and his most loyal lieutenants, and the most powerful of his priests, had retreated to their ultimate bastion. It was a place built to be unassailable by mortals, a fortress high in the Velethi mountains, a place that touched the sky, a place that held Alduin's most terrible secret, his personal private portal to the afterlife. The tongues had won the world of the living. Now they had to assault the gateway to the dead. They had to attack. Skuldafn, Dragonrend, was the great equalizer. It had given the Nords the power to drag the gods from the sky and slaughter them on the earth. The valleys were theirs, the holds were free, and the lower temples were cleansed with fire and steel. But the war was not won. Alduin, the World Eater, was still a god, and he, along with his most powerful, most devout priests and his last legion of dragons, had retreated to their ultimate bastion, their final, unassailable fortress, Skuldafn. This is the core in-game fact that defines the late war period. Skuldafn is not a fortress you can simply walk to. It is not connected to any mountain pass. It is a temple complex of staggering size, built on a remote, isolated peak high in the Velothi, or some say the Gerald Mountains, a place reachable only by air. It was the cult's ultimate gated community, and the gate was 5,000 feet of sheer, icy cliff face. This was its primary defense. To the dragons, it was a home base. To mortals, it was a sheer, impossible wall. But Skuldafn was more than a fortress. It was a temple of the highest, most terrible order. For deep within its inner sanctum, Alduin had built his greatest blasphemy. It was a great shimmering portal, a magical vortex that did not lead to some dark plane of oblivion. but shimmered with the cold, ethereal light of the afterlife. It was a direct one-way gateway to Sovngarde, the Hall of Valor. This was Alduin's personal pantry, the employees' only entrance to the Nords' all-you-can-eat soul buffet. From here, he could enter the Hall of Shore and feast on the souls of the dead, growing ever stronger, his arrogance literally fed by the spirits of his enemies. The tongues knew they could not win as long as this portal remained open. Alduin was not just respawning his troops. He was constantly powering himself up on the souls of their own fallen. He was, in effect, eating their army. The assault on Skuldafn was not just a military objective, it was a desperate spiritual necessity. They had to close the restaurant, but how? Hakon, Gormle, and Feldir stood at the base of the mountain, looking up at the impossible peak. Dragons circled it like vultures. They could use clear skies to hold off the blizzards, but they could not shout wings onto their soldiers. This is where a huge community debate rages. How did the Nords assault a fly-in-only fortress? The lore is silent, leaving us to piece together the most likely and most heroic scenario. They didn't fly, they climbed. Feldir the Old would have known it was a suicide mission, but it was the only one they had. He, Hakon, and Gormle would have led an elite force, the absolute best warriors and lesser tongues they had left. This was not an army. It was a climbing expedition from hell. They would have begun their ascent under the cover of a raging unnatural blizzard, perhaps summoned by their own allied mages, or perhaps just a gift from Kyne. Imagine the scene. 1,000 of Skyrim's greatest heroes scaling a sheer wall of black ice. The wind is a screaming 100-mile-per-hour torrent. Below them, a 10,000-foot drop. Above them, the looming dark architecture of Skuldafn. And then, the dragons hear them. The assault begins. Dragons, unable to land on the sheer face, scrape themselves along the cliff, breathing gouts of fire that turn whole sections of the ice wall into a waterfall, sending dozens of Nords screaming into the abyss. Dragon priests float out from the ramparts, hurling lightning storms, shattering the ice. The Nords are massacred, but they are Nords. They are rage. They keep climbing. For every 100 that fall, one makes it to the top. Hakon. One Eye, Gormleth, and Feldir are the first over the wall. They land on the ramparts, their axes and shouts a whirlwind of pent-up fury. The battle for Skuldafn had begun. It was a brutal, close-quarters brawl on high, windswept bridges and narrow stone ledges. The tongues used Dragonrend to ground the dragons who guarded the courtyards, their axes hewing their wings before they could take off again. The priests, the final elite guard of the cult, met them with terrible ancient magic. But the tongues had one target, the Great Portal. They fought their way through the temple, through halls slick with the blood of their own, until they reached the great open-air sanctum. And there it was, a swirling, mesmerizing vortex of light. On a raised dais before it stood the final guardian. This is the obscure lore tidbit that explains the portal's function. In the game, this guardian is the dragon priest Nahkreen, whose name means vengeance. He was not just a priest, he was the gatekeeper. He held a great rune-carved staff, the dragon priest's staff, which was the key. It was the focus, the magical battery that kept the portal to Sovngarde open for his master. As the tongues entered, Nahkreen raised the staff. He was Alduin's final vengeance, the last line of defense. The three heroes, battered, bleeding, their companions dead or dying behind them, faced the archpriest. The duel that followed was a clash of titans. Nahkreen was a master of the voice and devastating shock magic, his power amplified by the portal at his back. He was perhaps the most powerful priest after Varlock. Hakon charged, his axe meeting a wall of lightning. Gormleth used whirlwind sprint to flank her golden hill to blur. Feldir countered shout with shout, their voices a deafening roar that shook the very stones of the temple. And this is where the fan theories diverge. Why didn't they just jump through the portal? They were right there. Why not take the fight to Alduin in Sovngarde? The most logical theory is that they couldn't. They weren't Dragonborn. To them, the portal was a one-way, soul-flaying machine. Only Alduin, with his unique nature, could traverse it safely. Or, more likely, they knew that to fight Alduin in his own realm, a realm where he literally ate the souls, of the dead was a fool's errand. They were not there to follow him. They were there to lock the door behind him. Gormleth, in a final, glorious suicidal charge, broke through Nahkreen's guard. Her sword plunged deep into the priest's chest. For a moment, all was silent. Nacreen staggered, his mask looking at the blade, then at Gormleth, in what must have been pure cold shock. He dropped the staff. It clattered on the stone. The portal behind him wavered, the light flickering. Feldir the Old, seeing his chance, lunged. He did not grab the staff to use it. He grabbed it, and with all his remaining strength slammed it against the stone dais. The staff shattered. The flow of magicka was broken. The great portal flared, a blinding flash of white light, and then snapped shut with the sound of a thunderclap. Silence. They had done it. Alduin was cut off. The soul stream was severed. They had taken away the World Eater's food. It was the single greatest victory of the war, but it came at a terrible price. They were trapped. They were on an unassailable mountain, their forces decimated, and they had just, in essence, rung the dinner bell and then locked the fridge on the most powerful, arrogant, and now famished being in existence. Alduin, enraged, his connection to Sovngarde severed, was no longer a distant god. He was a cornered animal, and he was coming. He was coming for the only other place he held sacred, the place where his brother, the traitor, was hiding. The throat of the world. They had locked the pantry. They had cut Alduin off from his soul stream in Sovngarde, a victory that had cost them nearly everything. The battle at Skuldafn was a Pyrrhic one, and the survivors, Hakon, Gormleth and Feldir, were now trapped on an impossible peak, having just enraged the most powerful being on the planet. How they escaped Skuldafn is a story lost to time, a desperate, untold chapter of the war. Perhaps Paarthurnax, seeing the portal snap shut, was roused from his meditation and flew to their rescue, his great wings battling the last of Alduin's lieutenants. Or perhaps in the chaos, they found a lesser portal, a forgotten back door. However they did it, they knew the war was not over. It had just entered its final, desperate phase. Alduin was still on Mundus. He was cut off, he was starving, and he was furious. His rage was an apocalyptic force, a storm of pure, divine malice. He had lost his temples, he had lost his army of priests, and now he had lost his connection to the afterlife. He had nothing left but his own, infinite arrogance and his unkillable nature. He gathered what few dragons remained loyal, and made his way to the one place that represented the heart of the rebellion, the throat of the world. He was going to kill his brother Paarthurnax, and he was going to burn the world down as he did it. The Three Tongues knew this. They met him there, on the snow-blasted, wind-scoured peak where time itself feels thin. It was the roof of the world, and it would be the stage for the final battle. Paarthurnax was there, coiled on his rock, his ancient eyes full of a terrible, grim understanding. This was the end. This is the core, in-game fact that the Dragonborn witnesses as a psychic echo, the final confrontation between the tongues and the World Eater. Alduin descended from the sky, a storm of black scales and pure malice, his roar a physical force that shook the mountain. Zin, Krief, Voth, honor, battle, with. He was challenging them, his voice dripping with contempt for these mortal ants who had dared to touch him. Gormleth Golden Hilt, her fury undiminished, her golden blade held high, answered first. She stepped forward, her voice the equal of his, and hurled the ultimate insult at the God King. Jaw! Zar! Frool! Dragonrend struck the World Eater, and he faltered. Even Alduin, the firstborn of Akatosh, was not immune to the concept of mortality. He had never been forced to comprehend it. The shout, that blast of pure mortal spite, ripped into his divine essence. He roared, not in anger this time, but in a high, shrieking panic. His wings lost their purchase on the air. He, the great black dragon who was the sky, tumbled and crashed onto the snow of the mountaintop, a god brought low, skidding to a halt before his mortal enemies. He was grounded, he was furious, and the battle was joined. Hakon One Eye, his axe a gleaming arc of iron, was the first to charge, his war cry lost in the wind. Ha! Gormleth was beside him, a dervish of steel and rage, her blade seeking any gap in the black scales. Feldir the Old held back, his voice a countermeasure, using Fuss to stagger the beast when it tried to rise, using Yol to counter its gouts of flame. Paarthurnax too was in the fight, a clash of brothers, tooth and claw against tooth and claw, a blur of grey and black, their shouts a deafening percussive war that tore the sky. But Alduin was Alduin. He was the World Eater. He was a force of nature. Dragonrend could ground him, it could terrify him, but it could not kill him. He was too strong. He swiped a great claw, and Hakon was thrown, his shield shattered, his arm broken. He snapped his great jaw, and Gormleth Golden Hilt, for all her speed, was caught. Her final war cry was cut short as she was crushed in the god's teeth and thrown, a broken, lifeless doll, onto the crimson snow. Hakon screamed in rage and grief. Feldir the Old looked at Gormleth's body, at Hakon's shattered form, at Paarthurnax being battered by his stronger, more savage brother, and he knew they could not win. They could not kill him. It was impossible. So he fell to his knees and unleashed their final desperate gamble. He was not a warrior. He was the mind, and he had brought a weapon that was not a weapon at all. He pulled from his satchel an artifact that should not exist in the hands of a mortal. He held aloft an Elder Scroll. This is the truly obscure lore tidbit. How did they get it? The lore never says. Did Paarthurnax in his ancient wisdom guard one? Did they steal it from a dragon priest's inner sanctum? Had Kyne, in a final act of desperation, guided Feldir to its resting place? It doesn't matter. It was there. A kell. A fragment of creation, an instrument of prophecy that is both the music and the musician. Alduin saw it. And for the first time he screamed. He knew what it was. He was a being of time, and this was an artifact that could unwrite it. He lunged, not at Hakon, but at Feldir. But he was too late. Feldir the Old unrolled the scroll. The world ended. This is the great fan debate. What were they trying to do? Were they trying to delete Alduin from history? Were they trying to learn a shout that could kill him? The consensus is that they had no idea what would happen. It was a panic button, a stick of divine dynamite, and Feldir was just hitting it with a hammer, praying it would solve the problem. The moment he looked at the impossible, shifting runes, his mortal eyes were burned from their sockets, seared by the raw, unshielded truth of creation. But he did not stop. He read. He spoke the words he saw, words that were not words. He was not casting a spell. He was looking at all of time at once, and with his mortal will, he was forcing a mistake. He was creating a wound in time. The throat of the world dissolved. There was no snow, no sky, only a swirling infinite vortex of when. Hakon and Paarthurnax were frozen, caught in the temporal blast. Gormleth's dead body was for a moment alive again, and then just dust, and then a child. Alduin, as a being of time, was caught in the very centre of the vortex. He was unanchored. He was ripped from the Teed, from the now. The Elder Scroll, in its infinite chaotic wisdom, could not delete him. He was a fact of reality, as vital as Akatosh himself, but it could move him. With a final, terrible, multidimensional snap, the scroll flung him, not backwards, not sideways, but forwards. It hurled him, tumbling and roaring in confusion through the currents of time. He was an arrow, shot from the bow of the Merethic era, aimed at the unseen, unknown target of the Fourth. The vortex collapsed, the light vanished, the sound snapped back into existence. The throat of the world was silent, save for the wind. Gormleth Golden Hilt lay dead in the snow. Hakon One Eye was alive but blinded, his axe fallen from his broken arm. And Feldir the Old, he was just a breathing, mindless husk, his eyes smoking holes, his mind shattered, adrift in the infinite echoes of the scroll. They had won. But they had not killed the World Eater. They had simply, in their desperation, made him someone else's problem. They had pushed their failure forward, thousands of years into the future, and bought the world of men an age of freedom, paid for with their lives, their sight, and their sanity. The silence on the throat of the world was deeper than the snow. Alduin, the World Eater, the God King of Skyrim, had vanished in a blast of temporal paradox. His final, uncomprehending roar was swallowed by the very time he claimed to command. Gormleth Golden Hilt lay still, her golden hilt red with her own blood, her soul finally on its way to the Sovngarde she had just helped liberate. Hakon One Eye was alive, but his world was a new, permanent darkness, his remaining eye scorched by the periphery of the Elder Scroll's power. And Feldir the Old, he breathed, but he was gone. His mind was shattered, adrift in the infinite chaotic ocean of all time that he had witnessed. This was not a victory. It was an amputation. The heroes had not won. They had survived and paid a terrible price to merely postpone the apocalypse. The war was not over. The CEO had been fired in the most dramatic way possible, but the entire toxic mid-level management was still in place. Across Skyrim, the effect was immediate. The dragons, bound to Alduin not just by loyalty, but by a fundamental spiritual hierarchy, felt their king disconnect. It was a psychic shockwave, a sudden, terrifying emptiness at the centre of their reality. Their morale, their very sense of purpose, shattered. They scattered. Many fled, finding remote, high-perched crags like Paarthurnax to simply hide and wait, to meditate on this new, impossible reality. Others, still clinging to their pride, tried to establish their own petty tyrannies, but they were now hunted, leaderless, and terrified of the new, impossible shout that mortals were hurling from the ground. But the dragon priests were different. They were not just followers, they were fanatics, and they were bound not just by will, but by dark pacts and necromancy. They could not flee. Their undeath, their very existence, was anchored to their temples, their sarcophagi, and the terrible masks they wore. They were cornered, and like any cornered fanatic, they became infinitely more dangerous. The war for the Nords now changed from a desperate rebellion to a grim, bloody, and systematic campaign of extermination. This was the Great Mop-Up, and it would be just as bloody as the war itself. This is the core in-game fact that defines every barrow and ruin we explore. After Alduin's banishment, the Nords, led by the surviving tongues and the new generation they had trained, went on a continental hunt. They had a checklist. They intended to hunt down every single priest and put them in the ground. But this led to a terrible discovery, a truly dark, obscure lore tidbit that the game only hints at. They couldn't kill them. Not really. A priest like Miraak, Master of Plagues, or Miraak, Master of Souls, was not just a powerful mage. They were true leeches, in a way that would make a fourth-era necromancer look like a hobbyist. Their souls were not their own. They had bargained them away to Alduin, or perhaps to the dragons they served in exchange for their power. Their souls were anchored to their masks, or perhaps to their sarcophagi. When the Nords would finally fight their way into a temple, battle through hundreds of Draugr, and strike the killing blow on the priest, the masked horror would just laugh. His physical body would crumble to ash, and then, days later, he would simply reform, his undeath renewed, his rage doubled. It was the resurrection problem all over again, but on a smaller, even more horrifying scale. The Nords couldn't kill them, so they did the only thing they could. They became jailers. The new great project of the Nordic people was not construction, it was containment. This was the birth of the dungeon. This is the central, fascinating fan theory that recontextualizes all of Skyrim's puzzles. The great rune-covered puzzle doors, the claw keys, the pressure plates, the spike traps. These were not built by the dragon cult to keep grave robbers out. They were built by the victorious Nords to keep the priests in. It was the ultimate SCP Foundation protocol. The Nords would assault a temple, like Volskiga or Ragnvald. They would fight the priest, overwhelm him with the voice and sheer numbers, and beat him into submission. They would force his regenerating physical form back into his sarcophagus. Then, they would slam the lid and seal it, not just with stone, but with their own new magic. They would propitiate the old gods, the animal gods, the very ones the cult tried to erase, and beg them to stand guard. The great doors with the eagle, the wolf and the bear were not locks. They were prayers in stone, divine wards. They invented the claw keys, mechanisms of incredible complexity, and then they split them up, scattering the pieces, giving one to a trusted family, hiding another in a remote cave, ensuring that no one person could ever accidentally undo the seal. It was a brilliant, desperate, and ultimately flawed system. They were putting a cosmic-level monster in a box, locking it, and then throwing away the key. They just hadn't counted on how persistent or nosy a Dragonborn adventurer would be a few thousand years later. Every time you solve a puzzle door, you're not being clever. You're breaking a millennial-old quarantine seal on a biological weapon. The greatest of these containment projects was Labyrinthian. The city, already a place of dread, likely became the last great stronghold of the cult. Here, the most powerful of the remaining unsealed priests, perhaps even the mythical Kyne himself, made their final stand. The Nords, in their final battle, could not breach it. The magical defences were too strong, so they didn't. They brought in their tongues, their earth movers, and they did the only thing they could. They buried it. They used the Thu'um to collapse the mountainside, entombing the entire city complex under millions of tons of rock and ice, sealing the priests inside alive. It was not a tomb, it was a prison left to fester for millennia, until the College of Winterhold, in their infinite wisdom, decided to poke it with a stick. The dragons were hunted to near extinction. The priests were sealed in their puzzle boxes. The Nords finally were free. The cost was staggering. Gormleth was a glorious martyr. Hakon, the blinded hero, would live on as a revered teacher, the first true master of the new Nordic tongues. And Feldir, his shattered mind was seen as a holy sacrifice. He was the saint of the war, the man who had looked God in the face and paid the price. The tyranny was over. The Empire of Stone was now an empire of tombs, and across Skyrim a new vow was taken: never again. The war was over, the tyranny was broken. The priests were sealed, and the dragons were scattered, hunted and leaderless. The Nords were, for the first time in memory, truly free. They began to rebuild, to build homes for themselves, to raise families free from the shadow of a master. But their freedom was haunted. It was haunted by the ghosts of the thousands who had died, and it was haunted by a terrible secret knowledge. Alduin was not dead. Hakon One-Eye, now blind, became a revered elder, the living embodiment of their victory. But Feldir the Old, the true architect of that victory, was a shell. He sat in a high, quiet place, perhaps in High Hrothgar itself, cared for by the first generation of new, peaceful tongues. His eyes were scarred, milky voids, but they saw. His mind was shattered, but it was shattered by time. And so he babbled. He spoke in whispers, not of the past, but of the future. He spoke of what he had seen in the unshielded light of the Elder Scroll. He described in broken, terrified phrases a world thousands of years hence, a time of civil war, a time when the children of Skyrim had forgotten their history, and he spoke of a shadow returning. He spoke of the World Eater bursting back into the Teed, the now, his hunger ancient and absolute. But the scroll had shown him one more thing. It had shown him a final champion, not three, but one. A soul, born with the blood of the Dove, a final true Dragonborn. The Nords, in their wisdom, knew they could not let this knowledge die. Hakon and the New Tongues listened to Feldir's prophecies. They understood that their victory was not an end, but a pause. They had not won the war. They had just bought the world a few thousand years to prepare for the final battle. They had to leave a message, a warning, a guide. And so, the last great act of the Dragon War began. They chose a sheer cliff face of black stone, a place that would be safe, a place that would endure. And they began to carve. This is the core in-game fact that ties the ancient past to the player's present, the creation of Alduin's Wall. This was not a monument to victory. It was an instruction manual for the apocalypse. It was the most epic in case of emergency break glass sign ever created. Though it was less a sign and more a here's how to slay a god, we hope this helps good luck. They carved the entire war into the stone. They carved the first panel showing the dragons ruling over bowed, subservient men. They carved the second showing the uprising, the gift of Kyne, the first tongues. They carved the third, the central, most vital image, the three heroes, Hakon, Gormleth and Feldir, looking to the sky, striking a dragon with the new impossible shout, Dragonrend. They carved the fourth panel, the banishment, the chaos of the Elder Scroll, the hole in time, and then they carved the prophecy. They carved Alduin's return, and they carved the final, hopeful, terrifying panel. A lone figure, Dovahkiin, his back to the wall, his sword raised, facing the returned World Eater. This was their message in a bottle hurled into the vast dark ocean of the future. This is where we find a crucial, obscure lore tidbit that explains how this wall, this Nordic history, ended up in an Akaviri fortress. The Nords carved the wall. But as the centuries turned into millennia, they forgot. The Dragon War became a myth. The priests became scary stories. The barrows became places for adventurous and stupid teenagers to get themselves killed. Paarthurnax, in his grief for Gormla and his shame for his own past, retreated into his philosophy of peace, teaching the way of the voice as a tool of meditation, not war. The tongue's power was tamed, forgotten. The wall was lost to time, buried by snow, covered by moss. Then, invaders came from Akavir, the dragon hunters, the Seishi. They too were fighting dragons in their own land. They came to Tamriel and found the dragons, already broken. They heard the legends, the myths, and in their searching, they found the wall. To them, it was not a myth, it was a revelation. They were the ones who recognized its power, its truth. They, the Proto-Blades, built Skyhaven Temple around the wall, becoming its new guardians. They were the ones who would wait for generations for Feldir's vision to come true. This, of course, creates the greatest fan debate of all, the prophecy. Feldir saw the last Dragonborn. Did he see it? Or did the Elder Scroll, by showing him, create it? Is the Dragonborn a hero of destiny, or a pawn in a self-fulfilling prophecy, a causal loop started by Feldir's desperate act? It is the ultimate question of the Elder Scrolls. Is your path chosen, or do you choose it? The Nords, in their time, didn't care. They just knew, with absolute certainty, that the end would come. And so, all the pieces were set upon a game board that would not be played for 4,000 years. The priests were sealed in their puzzle boxes, their Draugr attendants slowly going mad. The dragons were scattered, hiding. Paarthurnax was meditating on his mountain. In Apocrypha, Miraak, the other Dragonborn, was plotting his own return, a prisoner of Hermaeus Mora. And the wall, the great stone prophecy, waited in the dark. The war was over, the long cold peace had begun. All that was left was the wait. And so, the great carved wall waited. A silent sentinel of black stone tucked away from the world by its new strange guardians, a promise of a future hero, and a prophecy of a future inevitable doom. But that hero's journey, the tale of the last Dragonborn, is a sprawling grand chronicle for another night, a story of shouting down kings and absorbing the souls of old enemies. Tonight, our story, the full dark history of the First War is over. The great terrible tyranny of the dragon cult has finally and completely ended. The souls of Hakon and Gormleth are safe in Sovngarde, their long watch over, their mead cups finally raised. Feldir's broken mind is at last at peace. The tombs are sealed, the puzzle boxes are locked, their claw keys scattered, their traps set. The last of the dragons have retreated to the highest, most forgotten peaks, their roars fading into the whisper of the wind. Paarthurnax sits, coiled in his endless meditation, the snow piling on his ancient grey scales, his daily struggle against his own nature continuing in the silence. All across Skyrim, the land is still. The snow falls softly, endlessly, covering the ancient stones, muffling the memory of the Thu'um. The land is at peace for a time. The World Eater is lost in the currents of time, a distant sleeping echo, and you, Lawmaster, can rest as well. There are no priests to fear tonight, no dragons circling in the dark sky. There is only the soft dark, the comfort of your bed, and the gentle hum of the fan in the background. Let the shadows of the Merethic era fade. Let the memory of the war dissolve into dream. Your own journey is over for today. Sleep well.